Thank you very much for being here on a Saturday evening. Thanks, of course, to the organizers for inviting me, and to our wonderful speakers tonight for the papers that I was frantically taking notes on. Okay. So I'm Angela. I work at the University of Edinburgh, and as you can see, my title, Left with Tina, is quite declarative. So I will just start by saying that these are the 4 parts of the paper I was planning to present. But because I realized I have less time, I will have to skip part of the argument, and we can talk about this later. So I'll start, of course, with the first part on Generation X. And when I was a student in the early 90s, I read Douglas Kaplan's book, a novel, Generation X, Tales for an Accelerated Culture. And the book's titles and slogans, I have brought some, you know, they sound awfully familiar. As you can see, like our parents had more, quit your job, and so on, or economy of scale is ruining choice, theoreticize intelligence, of course, semi-disposable Swedish furniture, rebellion, postponement. And the most important one, at the end, a slogan from this book, you might not count in the new order. The novel became the Bible of post-1989 Western youth, self-diagnosed with various things, including, and I quote, career insecurity and above all, alienation. Focused on labor, Kaplan had moved from the industrial proletariat to the service and experience economy in post-Fordism. And this is where we find the novel's protagonists, always ready to drop out. In fact, the hippie year of 1967 in Roger Zelazny's, an American writer, Roger Zelazny's Lord of Light, that is a science fiction reference to accelerationism, had now migrated by 1991 into the lived reality of a generation embodying the collapse of American dream capitalism. But the trauma lay elsewhere. Just before the financial crisis of 2008, a Gen Xer reflected in a British newspaper on what was his generation's Vietnam, and he answered, the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Eastern Bloc. In the wake of this collapse, Generation X perceived and described capitalism's full embracing of accelerated production and disidentified from it. So we were called the slackers and idlers and so on. You know, these were the names kind of given to this. Anyway, this generation did not rebel. As the 90s advanced, the anti-globalization movement emerged, questioning the IMF, the World Bank, but this movement mobilized only part of this disaffected youth, setting, however, the tune to anti, you know, A-N-T-I. And so the suspicion that you might not count in the New World Order became a certainty as the precariat, so familiar to the art world, emerged around 2000. So the precariat, of course, was a generation less bonded by birth date and more by a shared historical experience of redundancy. And therefore, the precarious were forced to take louder action in their confrontation with the intersecting and varied forces sustaining neoliberalism and its political outcomes. So who doesn't remember 2011 as the year of the protester? It was even a cover of Time magazine. Insurgencies were noted across the best part of the globe. Hopes arose. In 2012, Jodie Dean would write about Occupy in terms of offering the outline of a new party. And what she had to say about this was, the remarkable rupture the movement effects arises out of its organization of a radical collective response to capitalism. In January 2015, a coalitional, so a little bit later, a coalitional radical left party drawn from social movements and headed by a late Gen Xer who was age 15 when the novel came out, and he was very much seasoned in the 90s student uprisings, became government in Greece, on which a very dirty debt game was being played. And of course, I don't need to remind anyone here what the fate of Occupy and of the political party of Syriza has been. In both cases, considerable and diverse forms of violence, from bulldozers to capital controls, were exercised to make the insurgents capitulate. Yet here, I want to press the point that collectivism alone has not delivered, and that the anti-globalization movement was symptomatic of the limitations of an anti-political culture, which the Gen Xers' alienation, which I would formulate as an anti-work stance without an alternative, with the Gen Xers' alienation, form of alienation at its core. So to move on to, to the second part of the anti-struggles, the world, of course, did not end with these containments. In 2018, the anti-capitalist struggle, you know, we have always this the anti-capitalist struggle goes on as part of a wider political culture attached to what we would call, or I would call, opposition politics or politics of response to the phenomenal range of offensives launched by the status quo. My tenet in this paper, as part of a broad, incomplete, unfinished inquiry for now, is that the historically specific articulation of this struggle as a political process premised on opposition or anti-politics is another expression of the angst and estrangements of the post-1989 generation, making it in fact less and less recognizable, more and more disavowed, an alienation of the alienation, if you will, threatening to limit the struggle to an updated Sisyphus parable, you know, the guy who pushes the rock up the hill and the rock comes down and we start again. And this I would call a process of estrangement between the actually existing subject in struggle and the actually non-existing endpoint of the struggle. Generation X lasted very little, what we would call the short 90s, a threshold decade when the women of Eastern Europe were instructed, for instance, to move very quickly from feminism to post-feminism, right, within a few years, when Hal Foster, an American art historian, detected the speedy return of a fascistic subject in electronic culture, and when those who followed upon a defeated, dispersed, outsourced, that is, pacified or even suburbanized proletariat would exercise their alienation from a world in which they did not count, right, by withdrawing into microcosms. And in '97, uncannily enough, I published my first novel on this kind of alienation, which was called Antarctica. So I was very shocked, you know, to hear of to be invited to a conference on alienation called Antarctica. Anyway, as regards the art field, however, Nicolas Bourdieu's microcosms of interpersonal relations repurposed alienation as pragmatism. Pragmatism conducive to what he called better living, renewing thus art's promise of de-alienation. I have to point out that, and I'm sure you know this already, that relationalist text developed in the 90s, even if it became available later when it got translated into English to most people, but it's a 90s art discourse, right? So, yes, renewing thus art's promise of de-alienation in a surprising way. Microcosms proved very enduring, preserving collectivism in an elementary form while allowing for atomized ennui. They legitimized further an articulation of the social through different and why not antithetical goals. The mutation of feminism into the plural feminisms is but an example of this. As divisions deepened and antagonisms became exacerbated, microcosms pulsating around alienation eventually flourished into the all-engulfing culture of anti-politics. In environments defined by very steep divides, such as crisis Athens, this is plain for all to see. I've just brought 3 examples. From the cities now ubiquitously marked walls, where people come from all over the world, you know, to stamp their ante, to a parliament of fierce debates, and to art events of heightened effect, such as the group that actually stole the LGBT refugee group that stole one part of an artwork, this monolith, and disappeared with this as a protest against Documenta 14's attitude to refugees, according to them. Interestingly, and although I was not aware of this when I submitted my abstract for this paper, the Athens Biennial's current theme is anti. It hasn't even started yet, but it's coming. So yes, a few days after I sent the abstract, I came to know the theme quite well because of a controversy involving 2 invited artists. Luke Turner, one artist, withdrew from Anti after the biennial refused to drop Daniel Keller, another artist who had abused Turner online in support of artist Diana Havas, known for her alt-right posturing. And on this occasion, she had liked an image where a far-right symbol subverted an anti-Trump piece by Turner. And there's a long story here, but I'm not going to say I'm skipping it. Originally, it was in the paper. The controversy quickly unfolded into on us a questioning over the role of an artist institution in the specific form of alienation known as the aestheticization of politics. Critics of the Athens Biennial stance in the controversy took issue with its focus on anti. And so the anti-fascist group shut down LD50. They wrote, "The biennial's vision of anti as an attitude and nonconformity detached from any definite political orientation and of marginality abstracted from social history is presented as a daring transgression of rigidified political correctness. It is in fact a badly written celebration of the pleasure of political centrism. Anti begins with a list of places where middle-class artists go. The gym, the office," it's in quotation marks because it's taken from the curatorial statement, "the gym, the office, the tattoo studio, the dating website, the migration office, the shopping mall, the nightclub, the church, the darkroom." And the critics, I just brought so that I don't know if you know the story behind there, but the way that this neo-reactionary gallery closed down involved protest from people and from this group. And they continue. Sorry. The biennial, say that anti is not a neutral discussion platform, but an agonistic space hosting different approaches on how to deal with ominous tendencies in politics and culture. Diverse voices are essential to initiate a meaningful discussion on how to combat such issues. Dealing with these controversial issues is the exact core of the conceptual framework of the exhibition and denotes the urgency of anti. Again, this is taken from the curatorial statement. But the critics continue, all that this amounts to is yet another confirmation of the disabling self-regard of the bourgeois arts professional for whom nothing is more urgent or more terrifyingly under threat than the diverse, meaningful, controversial, and agonistic sound of their own voice, along with all of the vulnerable adjectives that they are paid by the word to say in it. It's an interesting comment because very often people are not actually paid. The crucial question for SDLD50 is one of strategy. And I haven't brought these quotes here, but it's in the article, which appeared in Mute. Anti-fascists in the art field, is the argument, as I understood it, must prioritize the material impact felt by those oppressed and destroyed by such hatred. SDLD50 accused the biennial that rather than doing that, it adopted the liberal strategy of dialogue, effectively a dialogue among the proliferating anti, thus offering a platform to positions that can range from the non-explicitly anti-fascist to the fascist curious to the crypto-fascist. To my knowledge, the biennial would exclude self-identified fascists, so this doesn't come into this. SDLD 50 implicitly accused the biennial then of replicating the model of representative parliamentary democracy, where a spectrum of fascist-related political parties, as you know in Austria very well, and of course I will mention here Golden Dawn, the AFD, the Front National, compete with everyone else for attention and power. Indeed, the argument that art institutions, and I quote, reproduce the limitations of parliamentarism and retain the concrete space of liberal democratic parliament as a kind of imprint or inner image wherever they go and whatever they do, was recently made by Samuel Baroni, who also examined in this paper that you can see there very thoroughly a number of nuanced philosophical positions on the matter that I will just not present here. There's nothing simple then about this anti-controversy in the art world. The contradictions this internal controversy reveals constitute the consensus on what democracy means at present. A democracy, as I have argued in 2015 in another article, a democracy of equivalence, an electoral accounting legitimizing the power of any majority over any minority. It is this equivalence that we witness as, and I quote, the free public expression of opinion Artur Zmejewski talked about in his well-known work, Democracies, from 2009, where micro-collectivities advocate their possibly antithetical, certainly, I would say, antithetical politics. This then appears to be an unsolvable problem and necessary shortcoming of the condition of democracy. But if so, I wondered, on what grounds can an anti-fascist group criticize an arts organization for operating according to the consensus on democracy, committed actually to engage diverse approaches, etc., on how to deal with ominous tendencies? The curatorial statement said that. Which means that I'm asking myself, as a self-identified anti-fascist, is there anything that makes my position not equivalent to that of a fascist within the current consensus? The moral argument that I am in solidarity with the oppressed, whereas the fascist is on the side of the oppressor, does not stand. Neo and historical fascists typically name an oppressed group, ex-nation, oppressed by foreign elements. We see this in Golden Dawn's discourse very clearly, right? So they also speak for an oppressed group, and as populism puts it, with an oppressed group. So in the culture of anti, I have also been asked in art if a cool anti-fascist, I quote, throwing a stone and killing someone is better than a fascist asshole who does the same. These were the words used, and I think it shows the language used reveals how easily, how easy the corruption is of political positions into lifestyles, okay? So the cool anti-fascist and the fascist asshole. In the political culture of anti, it has been possible to claim that neo-reactionary eugenicist Nick Land could be, and I quote, a Marxist deep troll. And I quote again, that Land himself even remarked that the alt-right is a mass political movement against capitalism, incubating unexpectedly from the right, end of quote. I have all the sources, but I don't have time to give you all the source of this. You will not then be surprised to hear that both artists implicated in the Athens biennial controversy place themselves on the left, with actually Keller claiming that the disagreement is merely on tactics. Observing all this that I have presented so far as symptomatic of an accelerated ideological interchangeability, I propose to also read it as a political process in which alienation is the main outcome. Embedded in the anti-political culture is the constant threat of being drawn into identifications with what you disidentify from. This is not experienced as an open-ended textual practice as we had in postmodernism, but as a dead-end social practice, which is a buzzword, you know, around contemporary art, of course. A dead-end social practice locked into Anti's anagram, which is, of course, Tina. There is no alternative. There is a loop in which everything can be connected with everything, and in the anti-political culture, anyone can be praised as an anti-capitalist and anyone can be accused as a fascist. Marx can be called, and has been called, and I quote, the first accelerationist. And as put by Diana Havas, who was defended constantly by Keller as a woman artist, that he was defending a woman artist and a poor woman artist against an established male artist. Diana Havas, in an interview, has said that her political sympathies change according to her moods and that it's fine. Or, as put by art accelerationist Robin McKay, we are considering untapped possibilities here. And of course, Robin McKay has said that he's a friend of both Nick Land, neo-reactionary guru, and the late author of Capitalist Realism, Mark Fisher. So, this is not a hollowing out of political positions, what we would call an emptying of meaning, along the lines of Fredric Jameson's famous appraisal of postmodern art as surrealism without the unconscious, if you remember from his big book on postmodernism. Rather, we're faced here with an overabundance of meaning, with a proliferation of content, making the form appear rock solid. And before I consider why we have such a high concentration of trapped content, let's see why the art field is such an attractive platform for anti-politics. So now I'm moving to the section called the art field as ideal democracy. Now, the contemporary art field is very hospitable to struggles, all sorts of struggles, to the idea of struggle. And I would say this is because of the blurry line between labor and participation, that both of which are required for the production of value. There's a long kind of like line of writing about this. Again, I will skip. So the exchange between the wage entrepreneurial, I'd use them as the same position, although Marina, of course, and I differentiate in reality, but for these purposes here, yes. So the exchange between the wage entrepreneurial condition and the uncorrupted from money life, protest, affect, play, activism, love, intellect, exploration of civil society can be very speedy, or both states can overlap. And this makes the art field appear like an ideal space for pursuing whatever political cause. Art is actually where a social subject can spend self-consciously and by choice a lifetime dedicated to a political cause in purity, such as feminism, without the pressure of taking power and without changing the world. The struggle continues in the art field day and night, so I'm not going to blame the project about this. On the contrary, I would say that the immersion in the art world is what produces this effect. When the outside world goes to the gym, watches Netflix, worries about money or children, migrates for work rather than rebel against work, joins the protest rally, and then returns to the flattening everydayness for the next 3 months. But as an artist friend from a post-Soviet republic complained to me in '98, right? She said about what she was doing at that time in Estonia, where here all night debating nationalism and the nation watches football. So, who does not recognize this world? It is actually the one described in the curatorial statement of Anti. I did not include one thing here, which is that this subject goes to artist-run space as part of this world. And I didn't, because had I done this, you'd have thought ironically, oh, by world she means the middle class. Just as the SDLD 50 group connected the anti-theme with the bourgeois arts professional, irrespective of the class background of the curators, which I don't believe it was researched. Why? Because it would have been superfluous. As superfluous as the word bourgeois in the phrase, because art, as an ideal democracy, carries an indelible class stamp marking anyone who enters it, and no number so far of precarious art workers has been big enough to challenge the imprint of middle classness. There is, of course, adequate material evidence about the diverse connections between art and the rich, from BP, you know, the sponsor of the Tate, to real estate, to offshore, and so on. But I'm not talking about this kind of articulation of art and class, which is, of course, incredibly important. Instead, I'm interested in how the process of struggle in the arts field, ideal democracy, serves specific class interests. First, I would say, because it makes failure acceptable and tragic by incorporating in a ready-made narrative of the failed avant-gardes. As such, it becomes the salient, updated case study of Lyotard's libidinal economy, where selective enjoyment of oppression is linked with the suspicion that the system of capital is, when all is said and done, natural. Second, the art field practices critique, being the most experimental, open-minded, self-critical, that's very important, context for pursuing political causes. It is the opposite of Trumpness. As Jodi Dean notes in claiming Trump, she said that he is the most honest US politician. Trumpness ultimately reveals, and I quote Dean, the truth of economic inequality. Civility is for the middle class. These are then two ways in which class hegemony, as ideological hegemony, of course, is served. And moving on to the final part, alienation in struggle, anti-politics as the hegemony of prefigurative anti-communism. In the beginning, we were told, there is May 68, the Western political experience which marks the rise of contemporary art. Sorry, that's a bit running ahead of me. Yes, so Grant Kester, in his article, Lessons in Futility, and especially the section, it's published in third text, especially the section May 68 and the Third Way, summarizes the intellectual justification of the Foucauldian take on diffused power and of postmodernism, he doesn't mention either, following the dead end of May 68 as a politics of opposition, of course, right? Or refusal. He gives this amazing quote. So the Student Writers Action Committee wrote in a statement on the 20th of May, as you can read, we push a refusal to the point of refusing to be assimilated into the political groups that claim to refuse what we refuse. So, Kester comments ironically on the outcome. He says, we cannot yet be trusted with the freedom that would result from a total revolution. Instead, we must practice this freedom in the virtual space of the text or artwork supervised by the poet or artist, end of quote. When it comes to how these developments impacted post-2000 art, he lists the following, not only this, but this is what I excerpted here: dissensus over consensus, rupture and immediacy over continuity and duration, extreme skepticism concerning organized political action, and recording of political transformation into a form of ontic disruption directed at any coherent system of belief, agency, or identity, which I think is the epitome of anti-politics. Let's say then that the post-1989 Generation X lived the disappeared East as a trauma because it was already told repeatedly as it was growing up that only failure is possible, and failure can still be celebrated. Writing in 2008 and 2009, Kester, this is actually from 10 years back, Kester notes the change underway, the mass shift to collectivism in contemporary art, highlighting both the possibilities, as he says, but also the aporia, as he says, of contemporary collaborative art practice. Kester has been very much committed, also like Jodi Dean, to collectivism. So, a decade on, we're confronted mostly with the aporia, I would say, and must wonder why the wave of collectivism is proving powerless against the highly invisible, invincible principle of dissensus. What the wave of collectivism has led to is the disposition of the art field as an ethical left, what outspoken right-wingers or centrists complain about in arguing against its political correctness, which cannot be comprehended in isolation from the trajectory of the political left. Both these lefts, the ethical and the political, exist as spectrums. That is, they incorporate various positions, right? And these spectrums at times align, at times they don't. The ethical left is mostly given to grassroots activities, activisms, and commoning, which I'm sure is a term you have heard. The political left, organizing into programs ridiculed in Britain by the right as Corbynomics, you know, that respond to ills and injustice. And both lefts find it altogether hard to overthrow the consensus of TINA, there is no alternative, which of course permitted both the dominance of neoliberalism as a class project, as David Harvey has argued, and the acceptance of democracy as the political culture of anti. In this system of values and evaluation of social movements and social practice, dissensus has been glorified into the single possible consensus. This is the case at least since 1985, when Laclau and Mouffe's hegemony and socialist strategy launched post-Marxism, post-Marxist political theory. In his two lengthy critiques of the influential book from 1988, Norman Guerras, they appeared in New Left Review. Norman Guerras notes, among other things, he notes that the argument is normatively indeterminate, fit to support virtually any kind of politics, progressive or reactionary, as well as how disappointingly thin are the ideas on democracy, and indeed connected with some of the more standard tropes of Cold War anti-Marxism. To remind us, this is the book, right, that Claire Bishop cited in her October article from 2004 in developing her argument of how art can be really a side of democratic politics and aesthetics. So, the contemporary anti-political culture of accelerated ideological interchangeability lends Guerras's remarks from 1988, I repeat, the cloud of a prophecy. Saving face as post-Marxism while the Soviet paradigm was being discredited and China was reforming. We had the first wave of decollectivization of agriculture, foreign investors, private businesses between 1978 and 1985. The left did participate and even led the democracy of equivalence or of any kind of politics. But I disagree with Guerras when he proposes Cold War anti-Marxism as the pool of ideas for this twist of the plot. The anti-Marxist turn was rather symptomatic of capitalism's most successful and long-term campaign, anti-communism, always adapting to capitalism's own complex trajectory. I would actually say that Marxism itself has become the endless analysis of capitalism, marginalizing severely the analysis of communism. So we have a kind of anti-capitalist, Marxism that is quite limited in my view. If it can be drawn from Silvia Federici's Caliban and the Witch, it's a very interesting book, that capitalism arose as a response to the emergent threat of communism. If the suppression of the Paris Commune by the Republic fits in such a narrative, here I have condensed a very huge argument, the story of modernity splinters from the outset, so we don't have, because we don't have one modernity, is one possibility here. Yes, I say here time does not allow me to follow the speculation, although I hope I will maybe later. The fact is that today, a left unable and in party unwilling to deploy its intellectual, organizational, and grassroots capacities to think even about communism as something else than a left publisher's series, right? And how we have developed into a politics of opposition, including, I would say, anti-fascism. And this is why I'm presenting this paper, because my primary interest is how to have an anti-fascism that is not trapped in the political culture of anti. So, I think this is all very weak when it faces again an updated, modernized fascism as an increasingly credible politics of proposition. So rather than the politics of opposition, we have a politics of proposition here. And here I suggest tentatively that the first step towards ending the left as merely a politics of opposition and response, and towards reuniting the ethical and political left, is to combat the hegemony of anti-communism. Such combating would require, of course, very careful analysis and mapping to join the dots of what do we mean, to find the many faces of this violent evacuation of the historical scene that traps at the same time content into the same form. The hegemony of anti-communism is global, articulated both in material practices and discursively. We can observe it across the former East in long-term campaigns of evacuating public space from any traces of a very annoying history, change of street names, removal of statues, closure of archives, and of course reclamation and normalization of reactionary histories, including the constitution of fascist forces and soldiers and so on. We can observe it in the former West's regular press features against totalitarianism, including the EU's Remembrance Day for victims of totalitarian regimes, encompassing, of course, the combined evils of fascism and communism. The totalitarian string in capitalism is excluded here. In Greece, we have a particular variation of this with mainstream press featuring articles that's from this last month, September, about how we are the only communist country in the civilized world, thanks to Syriza, and with right-wing historians rewriting the history of Greece's civil war, for which they are rewarded with professorships at the University of Oxford. We find it in China, most remarkably, where the regime attacks and imprisons communist students who, in taking seriously their own school texts, reflect on what communism can be and take action. Yes, even the Communist Party leading capitalist China is very much worried about the possibility of people thinking seriously about communism, as at present all regimes sustaining the global distribution of power are. Indeed, the notion that contemporary China is communist plays perfectly as part of global anti-communism, making Stalinism as communism a less exciting episode in the series. On the other hand, China pleases accelerationists enormously. First and foremost, the aforementioned Nick Land, who moved to Shanghai and who in 2004 described, and I quote, the modern Chinese fusion of Marxism and capitalism as the greatest political engine of social and economic development the world has ever known. Here I would like to discuss Benjamin Noyce's take on acceleration, but I won't. Anyway, 11 years later, Land became the guru for the US-based far-right movement, Neo-Reaction, or NRX, as they call themselves, advocating the replacement of modern nation-states, democracy, and government bureaucracies by authoritarian city-states. That was a quote. 15 years later, he participated in the neo-reactionary conference accompanying a neo-Nazi art show at the now shut LD50 gallery in London. So, you see everything is connected. Yes, whose director and Trump policy supporter, Lucia Diego, described the left, and I quote, as more like a fascist organization than the real fascists, claiming the audience was liberal of that event. So, as argued already, one never escapes the accelerated ideological interchangeability of the anti-loop, where you can be called, whatever. More important, however, for the purpose of my analysis, is that accelerationism, a technophilia with a philosophical and a flexible social program, has come to fill the void in the social imaginary created by the hegemony of anti-communism, satisfying simultaneously a left that sees the mirage of a communist horizon, and a right that pushes for the legitimization of assisted yet natural supremacy. So it hits both. But you will say it is not exactly like this. Civil society is not just a loop of anti, and the left is not just a politics of opposition. There are many, if dispersed, initiatives of proposition clustered around the common and the commons, words that have the same root as communism. We're urged, I was ironic just there, we're urged to ignite the power of translocal social movements. I quote from a very recent article on this, rather than, and I quote again, wait for systems to change. We thought what this change would be, we'd just be waiting for systems to change. The art field is a keen facilitator and mediator of such practices. The previous iteration of Athens Biennial from 2015 to 2017 focused on communing, as also partly did the public program of Documenta 14, as many others. So there is no hegemony of anti-communism. I hope now that the irony underpinning my choice of art examples is not lost. And this irony, because you know very well how these institutions were precisely trapped into the anti-politics, right? The irony does not refer to those two institutions at all, as far as I'm concerned, but precisely to how they became engulfed in the anti-political culture despite intentions. Without irony, however, I want to follow Dimitri Vilensky from Stodelat, who noted about 10 years ago, notice how few people would call themselves communists, but there are many communists. So, actually, the conversation in which this was said was titled "From Communism to the Commons," with a question mark. I'm sorry, I have omitted this there by accident. So, and another issue raised in this dialogue was that, and I quote, neoliberalism is all about allowing commons to arise for the sole purpose of their subsequent privatization. And I would say that the language of social innovation often deployed in justifying such initiatives outside the art world is symptomatic of this, as is the fact that worker-owned cooperatives, such as the Greek Viome, they have to sell their products where everybody else does. So, as for the art field, insofar as, and I quote again from this dialogue, insofar as society is outsourcing its politics to art, and that has become extremely profitable, it is hard to beat the feeling that you have been installed as a ready-made on a certain cultural field and given a set also of privileges, which even include free collaboration and political radicalism. End of quote. So I would say this is the feeling of alienation in the struggle's political process. For these reasons, I would argue that the proliferation of commoning practices today in art or society, when detached from explicitly combating anti-communism intellectually and through organizing, merely recycle alienation as much as they help make life livable, generating heterotopias of conviviality, not too far removed from the principles of relational aesthetics. I fail to see how this differs from the stance of Generation X, as actually, this is a quote from 2009 on this Generation X, both the book and us, I guess. We didn't believe in global communism, but that doesn't make us advocates of global capitalism. And 30 years later, we really have to revisit this, I believe. So, to conclude, capitalism that presents the democracy of equivalence as its great achievement will not have a problem with anti-fascism, diluted as yet another anti. Anti-fascism becomes more content in the form. Capitalism hardly has a problem with anti-capitalism, including the soft proposition politics of commoning. As for art's attachment to agonism, I agree with El Baroni that this, as he says, this franchising of the empty signifier of democracy happens, and this is a quote, in the hope that this in itself will disrupt normal flows of information and exchange and destabilize the totalitarian streak in liberal capitalism, end of quote. I think the futility of the hope is analogous to the number of destabilization strategies we have seen since the emergence of post-structuralism, but not least in feminism. But I am not sure how his proposition of intersubjective practices of reasoning, this is the word, reasoning, would break the loop of anti-politics. How, in other words, reasoning would evolve into a political process that would eradicate alienation in the struggle, so long as we don't pose the absent problem that capital foresees and solves with prefigurative anti-communism, as of course communism doesn't really, for me at least, is not anywhere, so we have an anti-discourse that has an absence. So that's it for me. Thank you very much. Shall I take questions, or do you want me to sit down and we can move straight to the panel? Oh, okay. Oh, I also wanted, as you're thinking about questions, I want to, for me this was the epitome of anti-politics, the removal of the pro-refugee, the monument to strangers and refugees, which as German newspapers wrote, it was the most democratic process, and people had 7 rounds of votes to reach this fantastic event in democracy of removing an artwork on Reunification Day from Kassel, made by a document artist, as a democratic process and an outcome of contemporary democracy, this democracy of equivalence and accounting. Okay, probably that was...
Thank you.
Yeah. I have a lot of questions for myself, but probably you don't want me to have this dialogue here.
Thank you, Angela. I guess, should we move on to the panel discussion and maybe save the questions for afterwards? Or would you like to take a break for 5 minutes and then to digest everything?
Thank you very much. I think this is very, I think this is a very important argument, or I find it a really important argument, because if one, specifically what you said, well, if one thinks of anti-fascism and how important also at this moment anti-fascism is, then exactly the politics of anti is something which it cannot subsume to, and also which really poses a political problem to much anti-fascism today, because I mean, I only know it better from like the German left, and there, because so many anti-fascist groups formed in like the way in which they exist today in the 90s, and like in the turn from the 80s to the 90s, so they formed in the moment of renationalization. I mean, in Germany because of unification specifically, but this was a moment of, like in so many countries, of very, very reactionary governments. So you have very strong anti-fascist groups which formed themselves as anti-national and international solidary groups, but which today have a totally different historical moment. So would you say, so how do you think about that change in time? Because that's what I was thinking about, because I think I couldn't agree more, but I was asking myself if this is sort of the change, if like you have the shift, from the 80s to the 90s with conservative governments, and then you had something like the new Labour, and like its version of it in different countries, which sort of pretended to be a more social life, which of course it wasn't, but which made an ideological shift towards exactly this, what you describe as the politics of anti. So I wonder how you would see this shift, like within anti-fascism.
Yes, well, I'm not sure I would be able to see it, and I think it really deserves to be discussed, because I grew up in Athens, where in the 80s, when the UK, for instance, and the US were experiencing this, we had at the time what we thought was a socialist government. So we lived a super different like 80s, for instance, right? And the 90s were also kind of like different in that regard a little bit. So but I think that I think anti-fascism needs to be, at least for me, I don't have a history in my mind of anti-fascism completely. I think it's very piecemeal, you know, whatever I read seems to be part of something bigger, and I never have the kind of like total vision if that should or would exist. And I think actually, because I'm co-editing for third text a special issue on anti-fascist art theory, we have a discussion with some people in this room about precisely whether we need to have a global history of anti-fascism and what this would be, or whether it should be approached as a Western phenomenon, for example, in relation to colonialism, and whether there's something there that is very much tied to this. And yeah, which is not answering your question because I cannot answer it. So I'm sorry, but I hope many other people can, yes. Sorry.
I have a few questions or maybe comments or additions, but I guess maybe I'll just try and limit it to one. So I guess what I was really interested in is how, like, there's this kind of paradoxical link between a politics of opposition and a politics of absolute interchangeability, right? And kind of not, that anti-politics is the space of ideological interchangeability, but it's also like this kind of simple abstract opposition, which I think kind of links a bit to what I was talking about, this kind of circulation of simple abstractions, but I can say more about that later. But in a way it's, and this kind of like antagonism, Mouffe and Laclau also being a kind of hollow form, or this kind of, that can be filled with any content, kind of any equivalencies of politics, so it's actually depoliticizing in a very particular political way, which has to do with the whole history of anti-communism, etc. But I guess the question I wrote down was like, so do we need more or less polarization? It's like, is propositional polarization which is something other than the reactive cycle of anti, what we're kind of looking for?
Yes.
A determinate polarization rather than an indeterminate polarization, perhaps?
I guess my short answer, if I understood your question, is thank you, Marina, is yes. I think that precisely the contrast between a politics of opposition and a politics of proposition is very much highlighted in almost everything we do. And I don't know if we need more polarization. Preferably not. You know, I'm not an advocate of the, of the position that says everything needs to go to hell so that, you know, we realize how bad we are and we have to live our defeat so that, you know, I'm not saying that. So I can't answer that part of what is it that we need, and of course, who's we, you know, and so on. But I think that I find, for instance, commoning a politics of very soft proposition because there is this embarrassment around the option, I don't even want to call it a signifier. That's what I'm trying not to say all this time, communism. So when you don't have, but I don't think we could proceed towards imagining communism. I think that this needs to be a dialectical process through combating, that can emerge only through combating anti-communism. So, in case this was lost, this is what I was trying to say here, that we need to start from what we have. We only have anti-communism. And we can't really get any other model. So I think that a collective effort around this, and an open one, where at least we start using the word even within the anti-context, might produce some thought. Because now we don't have thought. We only have thoughts about capitalism. Endless analysis about this and how everything fits, including, for instance, social reproduction theory. Everything is around this deconstruction. And I see this kind of very much trapped. But polarization, well, I mean, the arguments about polarization, it has been put up there by the Invisible, Committee, by a lot of people on the left who also talk about communism as some kind of in a very poetic way, which is great, but it does not actually undermine the anti-communism as populism, and it cannot do this. So I don't know if we need more polarization. I think we need more and different theory, for sure. Yes.
Hi, thank you. So I'm gonna find the question as I speak. What I heard you talking about was a lot of like the way that we are stuck in a thought process that's very very stuck in binaries, very sort of simplified, oversimplified binaries that then it's like either swinging one way or swinging the other way. And when I think of a binary, it's on one dimension. It's like either you're one part along one line or another part along the same line, but it's all living in like unidimensional space. And the perspective which I have and which I think a lot of people will probably relate to in some level is like when you look at the political processes that are happening, like there's less and less, it becomes less and less meaningful. Like in the UK, I mean, I come from London, so like in Westminster you have like there's a crumbling of sort of faith in what that process is. And then it's like, okay, so then I guess kind of what I'm asking is like, well, what meaning does this have? Like, does it remain meaningful or relevant to keep dissecting everything along this unilinear, like one-dimensional thing that's either one way or the other way, and like somehow that process doesn't seem to reflect like a more nuanced life experience where we're not living in binaries all the time. I'm not quite sure what my question is, but it's sort of like I kind of question the meaning and relevance of like this line that we just have been along ever since the birth of modern democracy.
Right. Okay. Thank you. In this paper, I tried not to talk about binaries. I talked about a loop or a circle. It'd be closer to a Deleuzean thing where everything is connected somehow to everything else. So I avoided, because I'm not sure that we're stuck into a binary or a polarization. I'm not sure that something that is based on duality corresponds to the current anti-politics, where numerous positions, can be expressed as reactions to other positions against, this or that going on. So I think that, the question of life, for instance, because you use this word, right? Did you not use the word life? Yes. It has become a very complex word, certainly within art theory, or within the theory that addresses postmortem, and how life is distinct from work, for instance, right? So a lot of things are actually being questioned. If I understood you correctly, you talked about a kind of impoverishment of life today and how we can escape from that by moving beyond the binary on the line. Is this what you wanted? No. Do you want to rephrase it? Yes. I don't think that we necessarily move on a line. I think that we're in a very three-dimensional and multi-dimensional space. One part that was not included in the paper had to do with re-territorialization, this concept that emerges from Deleuze and the idea of the face and how the anti-politics actually correspond to this, but I didn't have a chance to present it. So I don't think this is a problem of binaries. I think that at a certain moment, post-structuralism and postmodernism did certain things there in feminist theory and so on, but I think right now, we're really focused on, we are experiencing whatever it is into all possibilities as open except the one that might actually break the form. That is really what, and I think that I didn't speak about life, but certainly the position on alienation I try to present, which troubles me very much, it has to do with life. It is about alienation through the struggle, because many will say, for instance, there is no struggle, nothing's going on, everything is about consumerism, and I disagree. I think there is a lot of struggle, and my question is how we are becoming alienated in this process. What is the struggle that actually becomes alive, which is demoralizing in the end, and why? So this is what I try to look at. Yeah.
maybe just a thought, which maybe we could talk about more, which is so part of this anti-politics, which is when the disappointment with the struggle becomes the turn towards a reaction. And this is something that seems to be happening in a proliferated way, especially in the art world. So is there anything that you could say about that? About alienation within the struggle, and then...
Well, I hope I did that for me this cannot be resolved like this. That it is the natural, I mean, we have this process which is not anchored anywhere, and everything is the politics of response. So I don't think that, and this is expressed for me anywhere. I didn't talk about feminism, it would have been my primary example, actually, to look at this breakdown into not breakdown, but in this kind of like division into feminisms and how they become actually antithetical. I think it's, so I think that the alienation is through this process actually of struggle, when you don't have an end of process, and I'm not going to belittle it as utopia, I'm afraid. I would like to see something that stands there, and of course the fascists have that. They have a very specific political, proposition, and I don't think, maybe they feel alienated for things outside, maybe they feel alienated with the rest of society, but I don't think they feel alienated within their politics or proposition. So I don't think this can be resolved for me, at least not for the left, and I only speak, within this context, is without re-anchoring, okay? And I talked about anti-communism because I didn't want to bring in communism as the, it was very important to see what is going on that is preventing something, because I don't know what name, we could give. But I'm saying what we're seeing here is multiple instances of actually suppressing these things. So we have like anti-communism, and we have it probably since the emergence of capitalism, which I didn't go into detail. So it's coextensive with this. So I don't think it is solvable. I don't think it's, no, I really don't think it is. I think we're very, trapped there as content. I'm sure people...
So thank you very much for this very inspiring but also very difficult lecture. And what you were saying last, Angela, is that what means there is no alternative? I mean, so that we are all trapped in there.
Well, our politics is, I feel. Yes, but sorry.
I mean that. So on one hand, left with TINA is a very specific historical moment that you are referencing in the 1980s. And on the other hand, I had the impression that you use it more trans-historical. So also today, we are left with, there is no alternative. And I was just wondering if being trapped is what you're talking about when you talk about there is no alternative.
Okay. In English, it was very easy to make this pun, to use this anagram of anti and tina, because it's immediately apparent that one converts to the other, kind of like linguistically. But I think that to talk about being trapped, I try to use, I think, a word that is very easily understood, and how. No, I don't think that it's a transhistorical experience. I think it's very specific today, which is why I started with Generation X that mentions, the novel that mentions Tales for an Accelerated Culture on the cover, which I think is quite forgotten in histories of acceleration, but not for me because, I kind of like, what's that? So, I think that we live in a very particular moment that has morphed into this anti-politics, right? This anti-culture, political culture, that's what I mean. I don't think it was always there, and I think that the great effort to do away with the prospect of modernity, a different modernity that was there possibly from the start, that is, from the emergence of capitalism, that capitalism is actually the suppression, you know, of this alternative modernity that might have emerged, which is, you might call it counterfactualism, but at least we have some arguments and readings of history that can present that. Lead us to today, where what we have to, we're convinced that we have to preserve is democracy as we know it, which is as the political culture of anti. And of course, I would stand by that side, yeah, if I'm threatened with something else. But at the same time, I'm questioning this. I'm questioning this deeply because I understand that certain struggles, including feminism, are bigger than our lifespans, right? They are transgenerational struggles, but at the same time, I just think that the hegemony is total and complete, and we're very much trapped into this. And I think I don't see any weakening of the system. A lot of people on the left think they see. I can't join this hopefulness. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Angela.
Yeah.
We had a very ambitious, over-ambitious idea to end this symposium with a little wrap-up session, but it's already 20 to 9 and we have to leave this space by 9 o'clock because then our beloved long night of museums is full on. Thank you very much. I really liked the almost like starting sentence by Marina. She said that alienation is one of those terms that is overpoweringly tempting to use in the formulation of generalities simply because it contains so many connotations and usages. This is indeed very true. Nevertheless, we learned a lot about alienation. It's a very multifaceted term. I admit that after these almost 3 days, that we, as organizers both of the symposium and the upcoming exhibitions, might have been a bit too much in love with the Michelangelo Antonioni a notion of alienation, which is indeed a very Western modernist concept. And I think it's very, very interesting to think about alienation also from a very contemporary perspective, because I think alienation is still there. It's even more than there, not only for xenofeminists. And so therefore I invite everybody to join us for the opening of the exhibition, which is on the 24th of October. I thank everybody, Marina, Angela, Kerstin and Michael. I thank you, dear audience, and yeah, let's continue to talk about alienation. Thank you.